Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic Live podcast series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Kalogeris, Vice President of Marketing and Product at Pragmatic Institute, and your host for this episode. I am extremely excited today to have with us Leidy Klotz, professor at the University of Virginia and author of Subtract, a book that I devoured quite quickly and have really enjoyed. So welcome, Leidy.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be here.
All right, Leidy, tell us a little bit. Well, first, let's give some context to the audience and tell us a little bit about you and your background and how you got to be a professor today.
Yeah, I'm an engineer by training, civil engineering and big things. I did that as an undergraduate and eventually did my graduate studies in kind of design for sustainability, kind of broadly defined, and became interested over time. I've now been a professor for about 13 years, more and more in kind of the decision making that goes into design, so less about the physical stuff that we make and much more about the thought processes that go into what makes us design things the way we do. And that's where the book comes from, is kind of a line of research that looks at, okay, when we're making these design decisions, design defined here as anytime we're changing something from how it is to how we want it to be. And so this applies whether it's a building or a piece of software or your calendar. Whenever we're changing something from how it is to how we want it to be, what's kind of our first thought about how to change it. And so we studied that a lot, with the hypothesis being that it seems like we tend to add way more often than we take away. And, after tens of thousands of hours of study, that's indeed what we found. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for the book, and, talking about the reasons for that, plus the ways to resolve it, and what it means for all different kinds of designers, and including the ones that you work with.
Yeah. So one of the things I think you do a great job of telling stories throughout, but you talk about the idea is that we tend to add versus take away when we think about how you make things better. And one of the examples you talk about is your kid in a Lego. And one of the things that sort of really, really made this thought process come together. Can you share that story with the listeners?
I'd love to. Yeah. And I mean, you couldn't make up a better story, it turns out, from how closely it ended up mirroring the research thought process that we found. So my son and I, he was 3 at the time, and we were building with his Duplo blocks, like those big Legos, and we were building a bridge basically, and the bridge wasn't level. So one of the support columns was shorter than the other support column. I tried to fix this situation, again, design being this act of taking things from how they are, so the unlevel bridge, to how I wanted it to be, which was a level bridge. I tried to do that by adding a block to the shorter column. But by the time I had turned around to bring the block to the bridge, Ezra, my son, had removed a block from the longer column. And I had always been interested in kind of minimalist designs. But I'd always been focused on the end state, so like, what is it about this kind of subtractive design? What is it about this iPhone that makes it so cool? But what Ezra showed me in that moment was what I was really interested in was the action. So the act of taking something away, and also the thought process that was happening there. So what happened to me in that moment, right? If Ezra wasn't there, I only thought of adding, and I would have just added a block to the shorter column and moved on and never thought twice about it. And that turns out to be what we tend to do when we're presented with these situations, whether it's Legos or grids on a computer screen or travel itineraries, or, we didn't study this, but I would guess lines of code. We didn't study lines of code, but we did study lines of text writing. When people are asked to make this thing better, they first think about what to add to it. And oftentimes we'll add and move on without even considering a superior subtractive solution.
Well, and you and your team recreated that study, right?
Yeah, we used Ezra's Duplos, which he's 6 now, and he keeps asking me when he's getting them back. He plays with small Legos, but so I'm like, why do you want those back? But we didn't use the exact bridge. We created another one that was even more. Because the bridge, you can argue that, okay, the additive solution is just as good as the subtractive one. And when we got to our studies, we wanted solutions where the subtractive solution was inarguably better. And so we created a version with Legos where basically you could solve the problem by removing one block or by adding 8 blocks.
Oh, wow.
And people, went to the 8-block solution because they overlooked subtraction. And so when they did that and we were telling people, hey, do this with the fewest blocks possible, we even incentivized them and said, if we gave everybody $1 to start the experiment and you lost 10 cents out of that $1 for every block that you added. So if you did the subtractive solution, you kept the full $1. If you did the 8-block addition, you only got 20 cents. And people overlook subtraction in that Lego version. We did, we had people making recipes. We had people changing travel itineraries. There's a travel itinerary to Washington, D.C. that we created when we were, we're like, how can we get people to subtract? Well, let's just create something that's like so ridiculous that people will have to subtract. And so this travel itinerary, I think it was 10 in the morning till 8 at night, or maybe 12 in the morning till 10 at night. But it was a long day, and they went to like 5 different memorials and 5 different museums, plus eating, plus travel time. And that was what was pre-programmed into the itinerary. And we said, okay, make this itinerary better. And people still overwhelmingly added to it on this drag and drop interface, where it was really easy to kind of pull stuff out and give yourself more time at certain places. So again, just the same kind of tendency to only think about, okay, what can I add? And then the most convincing demonstration in my mind was we created these random blocks on a computer screen, because the argument with Legos could be, hey, well, of course you added with Legos. That's what you've been doing your whole life. You're trained to do that. And then I could argue back, well, why is it that we add with Legos, right? Maybe that's evidence of the same thing. But anyway, all of the other paradigms kind of had this argument that, well, that's just that paradigm. But the grids on a computer screen it's a new thing. Nobody had any experience with adding and subtracting from these grid patterns. And we made these patterns so people were asked to make them symmetrical from left to right and top to bottom. And so the patterns basically had 4 quadrants. And what we did is put extraneous marks in one of the quadrants. And so you could either add blocks to 3 of the quadrants, make marks in 3 of the quadrants to make it symmetrical, or you could subtract blocks from the 1 quadrant. So again, the easier way to do it. Also, we didn't tell them to do it in the fewest clicks possible. And again, people overlooked the subtractive option. So we found it across, we tried to study it across 3 different contexts. So ideas, objects like the Legos, and situations like the travel itinerary. And this default to adding was present in all of the cases.
It was so interesting reading this, because I thought, I've never thought about that. And yet you could see all of the instances in your life where that's true. And I mean, I think for our audience, when we're building product, we're building particularly software, I think we tend to be like, what can we add to make it better? If customer service, you get a call and it's not, you're just naturally thinking, what can I add? What other features would do it? And it's such an instinctive piece. And then you think about the examples. You mentioned Apple. I mean, I think Apple's hardware in particular is a good example of what could they take away and still actually make it more intuitive, right? If you look at the little remote for your Apple TV versus your 50 button remote for your Cox cable, while it seems almost so little, but it actually becomes more intuitive. So, I mean, I can see this thing in all sorts of aspects, but I think the next natural question is, why? Why do you think we have this natural inclination to look at addition as the way of improvement over subtraction?
Yeah, and the second and third chapters of the book, I spend a lot of time talking about it, and the 4th chapter too, actually. And I think start with biological reasons, right? And just this things that have basically historically helped us pass down our genes, right? So that this desire to acquire food, for example, we need more and more and more of that. We want to stockpile food. That's been historically an evolutionary helpful behavior, in that it helps us pass down our genes to future generations. So, that could be one area, or, one activity that kind of spills over into our thought processes after doing that over and over and over again, that makes us more likely to think of adding as our first instinct. Another one that's relevant and biological is this just innate desire to display competence. And so this need to show that we can effectively interact with our world. And I was surprised how kind of biological that is. So, a classic example is bowerbirds building their nests. And the male bowerbirds build ceremonial nests. And then the female bowerbirds go around, decide who to mate with based on the ceremonial nests. And then the female bowerbirds go build a nest to actually raise the children in. And so the ceremonial nests don't do anything in terms of providing shelter. Their whole function is to show that the male who created this nest is effective at interacting with the world. And we all kind of share this desire to effectively interact with the world and to show it. And this is, one reason for that is because you feel helpless, right? If you don't feel in control of your surroundings, at least to some degree, it can be make you feel very helpless. And so it's this basic human desire that kind of lends itself to adding, right? Because it's a lot easier to show competence in the lines of code that you add. If you take the lines of code away, there's not necessarily a reminder that, hey, Rebecca was here and subtracted these lines of code to make this thing actually better. Now, I think, knowing that, we can think of ways to kind of subtract and show competence by doing so. But those are some of the biological reasons. I also think just culturally and historically, we just encountered a lot of situations, throughout human history where adding is the better solution. When there's no city built yet, when there's no code at all written, the adding is the only option to make these things, to improve that situation. And now we've gotten to more and more situations, whether it's, cluttered code or a overcrowded city or, too much stuff in my kid's room that I'm podcasting to you from, where there's just more opportunity because we've already added so much to take things away, to make things better. But we've got a long history of that not being the case. And so all of those things are reasons why adding could be our first instinct. But I mean, we don't need to dwell on that too much, because it's not, as you've pointed out, right? People do subtract code. People do subtract features from the remote. So it's not like it's impossible to do better. It just happens to be our first instinct. And so knowing about it's really helpful, but it doesn't need to be impossible to overcome it.
And I think and I also think we're not saying never add, right? It's
exactly.
Just don't forget to think about subtraction as a viable option.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yeah. I mean, that binary thinking is a huge obstacle to subtracting. So many of these conversations, I'll go through the whole thing, and then there'll be a question at the end, like, well, what about this situation? Isn't it better to add here? And it's like, of course. The point is not that subtracting is always better. It's just that we need both of these basic options at our disposal as we're trying to make things better.
And the muscle for addition is strong in most of us.
Yeah.
And to think of subtraction, we have to build it up.
Yeah, and a perfect example from our research, I talked about those grid patterns, for example, and we would give people a simple reminder that, hey, you can add or subtract to solve this grid pattern. And the reason we did that was to show that they weren't thinking about subtraction already, or to see if they weren't thinking about it. So when we gave them the reminder, they were more likely to subtract. And you're like, okay, well, big deal. You give people a reminder, of course, they're more likely to do something. But the reminder didn't make them more likely to add. So as you said, that muscle's already being worked. It's, we're tapped out in our adding potential, and the subtracting is where there's kind of an opportunity to find options that we've been missing.
So, I mean, I think that's a great point too. So you talk about a prompt. What else can our listeners do to help build up this don't forget to subtract muscle.
Yeah, the prompts are really, it's more than just the prompt though, because, and I think, hopefully my book does a good job of rearranging people's mental furniture so that they can think about subtracting across different contexts. But what we found in our experiments was that like that reminder on the grids didn't necessarily carry over to some other context, right? So the prompts need to be really close to where you're making the decision. So I guess the takeaway from that insight is that when we're thinking about subtraction, like right now, or maybe after you listen to this podcast, you could think about, okay, what are all the ways that I change things in my life or in my job? And so it's like, okay, when I'm writing code, I'm changing things. So how can I give myself a reminder when I'm writing code to also think about subtracting? Or when I'm, planning out my list for the week, how can I give myself a reminder to subtract when I'm planning my list? So that would be, in addition to to-dos, when I'm setting up my weekly calendar, I also force myself to think of stop doings. And that's not just things I'll say no to, but things I will actually stop doing, as in I was gonna do them. I did them the last week. They're on my calendar to do, and I'm not going to do them. And that's an example of kind of queuing subtraction in your calendar. So the cues are really helpful, but you've got to think a little bit more than just, okay, have a cue. You've got to think about how can I make the cue really present when I'm making the decision. Some other things that our experiments suggest would be helpful are increasing the attention you have to devote to the decision. So another thing that we did in our experiments to try to show that people were overlooking this was put people under cognitive load. And so the idea being that when you're distracted, so it's the equivalent of texting when driving, or when you're thinking about something else, you're even more likely to just go with the flow, the default option of what you would normally do. And we saw that default option is adding. And so sure enough, when we kind of overloaded people cognitively, we had this thing where we would put a scroll of numbers across the bottom of a computer screen, and they'd have to push an F whenever a 5 came by. So they're focusing on two things at once. When they had to do that, they're even more likely to add in the grids. And so what that means for us, obviously don't look at scrolling numbers on your computer screen, but also if you're doing a task that you want to have more of your options for, then don't try to reduce the distractions. And that's kind of hard because we also tend to add with information and with our ideas. So our first instinct to try to make our mental models better, or try to learn more, or try to make use of some free time we might have in our job or in our days is, hey, what can we add to our information stores? But what you're doing when you do that is overloading yourself cognitively and makes you less likely to actually subtract things. So there's a little bit of a catch-22 there, but I think again, adding is great. I mean, you can get a ton of information from podcasts and from other things, but also, are you thinking about, have you set aside time to kind of not inundate yourself with cognitive load? And that might help you kind of think of some of these breakthrough subtractions. And then the last thing that we found from our experiments real quick is repetition. So when we had people do the grids, for example, 5 times, often by the 5th time, they would come across the subtractive solution. And when they did that, they would be like, oh, of course, this is great. This is so much better. And so if you have the time to do repetitions in, some of these high stakes design contexts, that might be more likely to bring about a subtraction that you may have otherwise overlooked and moved on before you even considered it.
It's so true. It's like any muscle, right? You get stronger at it, but it also is sometimes. So I just moved across country. We were just talking about this. And so at the start of the pandemic, I threw out a ton of stuff. Getting ready to pack, unpacking. I still threw out stuff, right? Like every single, you're going through and be like, I still don't, I don't need this, right? There's that what's not needed thing. And you do tend to, not only do you get stronger because you keep doing that muscle and realizing it was okay, right? Like nothing horrible happened. But you also
Right.
tend to see more opportunities because you cleared out some of the noise and you went, oh, but look, there still is noise there, right?
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah.
it's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. That it ties back in. We were talking about competence before and like noticeableness, right? So I mentioned that if you subtract a line of code, then nobody notices that Rebecca has done that, but you notice, and and the more code you subtract, the more likely it is that someone else notices, or like, hey, what's different about this? You know, there's it's stripped down. There's something they might not even know why it's different, but they'll know it's different. One of the examples I use in the book is Bruce Springsteen. He's one of my favorite artists, and he's got a Darkness on the Edge of Town is one of his most kind of critically acclaimed albums. And it was quite different than the albums he had released up to that point. And it had just far fewer words, fewer songs, sparser lyrics, more sparse instrumentals. And it was different. And so he subtracted and was able to show competence through that subtracting. And I think that, you know, the more you do it, the more likely you can get to that kind of displaying competence through subtracting. I mean, Apple's a great example of that too. I didn't use it in the book because it gets used so much,
Yeah,
but
it does.
but
it's
it's true, right?
right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the noticeable thing about what they do. And it's so it is possible to subtract and show competence that way.
Absolutely. And I actually thought the cognitive load one was really interesting too. So my dad was a programmer for a long time.
Okay.
And when he got stuck, he would go play the piano,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just
And
kind of
there's
turn
like,
it off. And in that space, you know, he found the answer.
right. Yeah. And you can't just play piano all the time,
Oh.
but right. Otherwise you'd be terrible at coding, but like
Right.
as a mixture, and there's, you know, great examples of that all across the creativity research of, you know, Stanford professors going to walk around the hills of Palo Alto, you know, in their afternoon, and they come across great insights then, but it's of course balanced with these
Right.
tremendous periods of effortful information gathering. But it's, yeah, perfect example of how kind of reducing that cognitive load can lead you to think of things that you wouldn't otherwise.
Absolutely. So I have to say again, super enjoyed the book. So I have a wonderful team of marketing and product people, and read the book and like immediately was like, all right, guys, I want us to challenge ourselves to think about where we could subtract from what we're doing in order to provide a more additive experience, or a more additive where we think we'll actually end up with stronger results because we took things away. Everyone's first instinct was to look at their, and you touched on this earlier, right? Was to look at their to-do list of things they
Yeah.
haven't done and say, yes, I will not do those things. And I'm like, well, that's a good conversation as well, right?
Right.
But it's not the same as look at your calendar last week. What meetings did you have that you don't maybe necessarily always have to have, right? Like you
Yeah.
could cancel and do on demand, or what on the marketing side, like what communication to our clients is maybe adding more noise than it is providing solutions. And if we took some of that out, would they see the help differently, right? Those
Mhm.
kind of things. The first one, turning off meetings, isn't really, it's not super hard work, right?
Right.
But the other, like the changing the way your campaigns move, it takes effort to subtract, right? It's not a laziness and I'm not going to do it. You'd have to go in and change things around actively in order for there to be less at the end. And I think you give a lot of examples in the book. Subtraction, again, it's not just not doing things. It's not like you sometimes have to put very conscious effort and investment in to making that subtraction happen.
Yeah, that's also beautiful. I'm not available, but my liaison Rebecca will speak on my behalf. But yeah, because that's the problem, right? It seems like such an obvious thing. Of course, subtract. Like, why wouldn't we think of that? And okay, now Leidy's told us that we overlook it, and I'm not going to overlook it anymore. But you know, as long as we think it's easy, I think that's part of the reason we've overlooked it for so long. Is it's like, oh, this is just like going to happen. And yes, there are versions of less that involve not doing anything, but those aren't the versions of less that you want to give to your client or that make the world a better place. Those are just, hey, I didn't do this thing. Which again, you know, sometimes that might be the right thing to do, but saying My favorite story about this is from my friend Ben, who's another co-author on the research. And we were like 2 years into the research together. And he said, "Hey, I'm taking our research to heart. I told my boss I wasn't going to be on a committee that he wanted me to be on." And I said the same thing you said to your employees, which is, that's great, Ben, but you didn't actually subtract anything. To subtract, you have to do the active work of, taking something away that you are already doing. And so subtracting would be not going to your weekly faculty meeting that you've been going to for the last 50 weeks. And the to resolve some of these problems we have, that's the only way to do it. One of the examples I talk about in the book, the Army War College has this fantastic report where they documented how Army officers were spending their time. And it's really cool because from a research standpoint, it's really cool because the Army officers, each activity, it's like this thing takes 2 hours and it has to take 2 hours. So it's very regimented what they're doing. And they had all these requirements of things that they were supposed to do. And when you added up the time of all the things that they were supposed to do, it was literally more time than the amount of time they had in a year to work. And so it's so obvious. The only solution there is to take stuff away. That's the only way to relieve that problem. You've got to stop doing some of the stuff that you're doing. And the report, I think, I'm sure they figured out some way to resolve it, but the main recommendation of the report was to exercise restraint in the propagation of requirements. So basically, don't add any more stuff. It's like, yeah, but we're already overloaded. How are we solving this overloaded problem? And the tragedy in that, not a literal tragedy, but emotional tragedy, is that these Army officers are being forced to cut corners. And that was the only way to get through everything that was expected of them. And here's these arguably the most upstanding people in terms of following orders and doing what's told of, doing what their duty is. And now they're being put in this situation by their employer that they have to think about how to cheat. And I think all of us are, if we aren't careful, can subject the people we work with to that same thing if we don't allow subtracting.
But I think, you either find ways to cut corner or not to do it as well as you could. And that's also not as satisfying. I was actually just having this conversation with another one of my employees, and we were talking about we're our own. There's certainly things that I put on their plate where I'm like, where do you think they're going to put that, Rebecca? But, you're just enthusiastic and off you go. But we also do it to ourselves. Right? Where you're just like, but it's such a good idea. And I think it would be so great if we did it. I remember at one point with my aunt, she had this enormous teacup collection, enormous, hundreds. Like, that's fine. And if you want to buy another one, you just have to pick which one you're going to get rid of.
Yeah, that's great. And that's rules like that are really helpful too, in addition to the cues. I heard of one that another area that this happens is just in red tape, right? Red tape in organizations where it's like, okay, 5 people have to sign off for so-and-so to, take a vacation day. And then all of a sudden you're spending all your time signing stuff off. And it happens in all forms of government too. And so British Columbia, to address this issue, when people came with a new piece of legislation, they also had to come with 2 things that were already on the books that they wanted people to take away. So it was even better than the teacup thing. It actually relieved the burden. And
you get 2 for 1. That's great.
Yeah, 2 for 1. Yeah. And those subtractions make things better too, because now it's some rule that you don't have to pull, that wasn't beneficial in the first place, and now it's not distracting from more important rules and distracting enforcement from more important rules. So that can work in organizations too.
Well, and you think about some of the rules that you set up. Look, when Commonwealths were founded, the needs were very different. But the same thing's true with a company, right? When you're a startup, the rules are super different than they are when you're a mature company, and all those spaces in between, teams too. And so where it may make sense when you're small and there's 5 of you and you're trying to get things out that everybody signs off on everything, obviously that's not scalable, right? And that's kind of a silly example. But there are lots of things like that where you look at, that was in place before because it made sense. What can we trim that there?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, again, it's the larger company has need for different rules probably than the smaller company did. So you've got to add some rules too. But the problem becomes when you only add, right? When you only think about adding or not adding, I guess, but not thinking about, okay, how do we take away from what's there that's holding us back? And then you get these bloated, bloated requirements that aren't serving anyone very well.
Yeah. You shared several of the great stories that are in the book, but you do have some amazing examples of the power of subtraction. And so I would love it if you shared one more, maybe one of your favorite ones
Okay.
that show an example of where it's just really powerful.
I love Maya Lin. So
Mm.
for those who aren't familiar, she one of her most famous designs is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And if you've ever been to the mall in Washington, D.C., it's just striking. And what I like about it is, I mean, it's a beautiful design. It's subtractive in that it's cut into the earth, and just this polished slab of black granite. And we also know it's subtractive because Maya Lin's on record as saying how she thought of this thing, and she's like, I viewed it as a cut into the earth.
Mm.
But it's also like, it's stunning in this arena of large objects, right? So you're on the mall in Washington, D.C., you're competing with the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, all these things that are like big and bold, and the memorial stands out by contrast. So it's a beautiful example of kind of noticeable less, so subtracting to be even more powerful. And it's a nice example of adding and subtracting. So one of the really nice things I think about her memorial is that, yes, it's like cut into the earth and it's understated, but it has the names of every American who lost their lives fighting in that conflict. And that's something that's not necessarily on the other. So she thought about adding as a way to kind of improve the monuments, but she also used subtraction to her advantage. So that's one of my favorite physical examples. I would say that and then on the kind of writing, that as it ties into coding, I mean, there's just these whole host of people who over time have talked about stripping things away to make them better, from Leonardo da Vinci to, famous writers to Strunk White. I mean, Strunk White, you had to read their book in high school and in college, and their core advice is omit needless words. And then that even goes all the way back to Lao Tzu, talks about this in the context of our learning and our wisdom. And he's 2.5 millennia ago, he said to gain knowledge, add things every day; to gain wisdom, subtract things every day. So I love those just as like reminders and cues for our thinking and for our writing and for our creative work. But I also think they're great evidence of the fact that, hey, we're still overlooking this, right? Because Lao Tzu said this 2.5 millennia ago, which suggests people were overlooking it then. And his advice still rings true today. I mean, we don't have an equivalent reminder to, hey, add stuff every day if you want to be wise. But we need the subtractive reminder. So it's also evidence of the fact that we're overlooking it.
It's one of those lessons we have to keep learning, right?
Yes.
We all have some of those, and you think, I know this lesson, and yet I must learn it again.
Yep.
2 examples for me. I loved every example in your book. I won't bring those up, but one for me, along with the Vietnam Memorial Wall, is actually the 9/11 Memorial.
Yeah.
It's for very similar reasons that you talked about, right? All of these big skyscrapers, and there is a void,
Yeah.
right? And that void it's powerful, and you can see that it was certainly influenced by the wall with the names and pieces, but it's truly powerful in what they didn't put there.
Mm-hmm.
And then on a completely different note, I was at a Q&A with Seth Godin.
Okay.
I don't know if you know who that is, but like a big marketer. And I have never, ever, ever seen anybody handle Q&A like he does. Because
what does he do?
He just answers the question.
And then he stops.
Right. And he answers the question and he moves on to the next question. So we had this like volleyball microphone and you could pass around so he could answer a bunch of questions. And I was like, why is this so powerful? Like what? And I thought about it. And 2 things. One is I think often we use like filler while you think of the answer, and he didn't need to do that. Right. And then again, that sort of idea of I'm showing my competence with this really long answer, but instead he could just like give you the answer and you were like, oh, right. Okay. And that is when I realized, oh man, I don't do Q&A right. Tune in for the 3-minute version of the podcast next.
Well, it's perfect, right? Because the one thing he wants you to remember is there and there's not all this filler around it, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Speaking of brilliant things and things to remember, if you were going to have everyone who's listened to us today, right, do 2 things differently tomorrow, what would they be?
Stop overlooking subtraction and cue yourself. Think of where you can place cues to help yourself do that.
Leidy, this was super fun. The book was really fun. The book, again, is called Subtract. It's Leidy Klotz, Klotz, and you can buy that book anywhere that you buy books. And it really is a fantastic read and has really had me re-examine stuff. So I appreciate the time and I appreciate the thoughtfulness that you have on this topic.
Thanks, Rebecca. I likewise appreciate your thoughtful questions, and I will be using the Vietnam or the 9/11 memorial in future interviews. So I appreciate the example there.
That does it for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening, and don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.